"The company's changing direction," she said. And I knew before she finished the sentence that my time was up. "My name's Earl Simmons, 58 years old, maintenance supervisor at Steel River Fabrication in Akron, Ohio. 35 years I've kept that plant breathing oil in its veins, sparks in its lungs. I've worked through strikes, mergers, power outages, and 2 recessions. I've watched managers come and go like seasons. But that morning, standing in my boss's glass office, the only thing that mattered was the way she wouldn't meet my eyes. Linda Graves, new regional director, polished shoes, sharper tongue. She folded her manicured hands on the desk and looked at the paperwork like it was a loaded weapon. Behind her, through the glass, I could see the whole floor, the maze of conveyors, the glow of molten steel, the rhythm of men who still worked with their hands. "My men, Earl, you've done incredible work here," she started. "Compliments first. Always. But we're moving forward. The board wants modernization, automation, fresh leadership, someone who understands the new systems." I waited. The air conditioning hummed. She sighed. "We've decided to promote Chase into your position." Chase. Her son, 29, MBA, 3 months of on-site experience, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to earn it. I stared past her shoulder at the reflection of the factory lights trembling against the glass. I didn't speak. Didn't have to. I could feel the blood drain from my face, steady as the pressure gauge on a cooling tank. "Earl," she said, softening her tone. "It's not personal. You're outdated like a typewriter in an iPhone world." That line sat between us like a live wire. She actually smiled a little after saying it, like it was clever. I reached into my coveralls, pulled out the key ring that had hung from my belt since 1989, and set it on her desk. The keys clattered against the wood, metallic and final. "You'll regret this," I said. My voice was calm, even. "Years of working around heavy machinery teach you how to stay level under pressure." She blinked. "Earl, there's no need for hostility. I'm not hostile." I nodded once, turned, and walked out. Outside her office, the plant was alive, the way it always was. Noise, heat, motion. Sparks danced from the welders. Forklifts rumbled past. Men shouted instructions over the noise. Every system here had my fingerprints on it. Every line, every valve, every control panel. I walked the floor slowly, letting the sound of the machines wash over me. Some of the younger guys looked up, confused. They knew something was off. I shook a few hands, clapped a few shoulders, said the same thing every time. "Keep it safe, keep it running." They didn't know it yet, but they were about to be led by someone who thought experience was just an obstacle. When I reached the end of the line, I stopped near the old generator room, the one I'd rebuilt after the flood back in '97. I could still smell the oil and burned dust. I touched the wall, rough under my fingertips. This place had been my second home longer than my first marriage lasted. In the locker room, I changed out of my coveralls and hung them on the hook, the name patch E. Simmons looked faded, the thread coming loose at the corners. I left it there. The parking lot was half empty when I stepped outside. The sky was the color of raw steel, clouds heavy and low. I sat in my truck for a minute, engine off, listening to the faint roar of the plant through the windshield. Then I turned the key and pulled out. As I merged onto the highway, the local news played through the radio. "Steel River Fabrication posts record profits this quarter," the announcer said. "Company officials credit management restructuring and modernization initiatives." I laughed once. Short, sharp. The sun was setting behind me, painting the sky the color of rust. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. They could take my job, my title, my office badge, but not what I'd built. They said I was outdated. What they didn't realize was I built every system they were about to break. A week after they showed me the door, I still woke up at 5:30 like I had somewhere to be. Old habits don't die. They just wait for orders. I'd sit at the kitchen table, coffee steaming, staring at the quiet yard through the window. For the first few mornings, I kept thinking my phone would ring someone from the plant asking a question only I could answer. It never did. By Thursday, I got my first update anyway. Luis called. He'd worked the electrical side of Steel River almost as long as I'd been there. One of the few men who knew the guts of that place the way I did. His voice carried a nervous laugh that wasn't really laughter. "You'll like this, Earl," he said. "Your replacement skipped the pressure check on the main cooling line. Said it was unnecessary, computer monitors everything now." I could picture it clearly. Chase leaning over the console, flashing that smug smile, talking about efficiency while the younger techs nodded along. "How bad?" I asked. "Not catastrophic yet," Luis said. "But the readings are off. Production slowed, and he called a meeting this morning, told everyone we're defining workflow. Half the crew's ready to walk." I thanked him, told him to keep his head down, and hung up. My hands were steady when I set the phone down, but I could feel something under the surface, an old vibration in the bones, the kind that comes before metal gives way. I spent the rest of the day fixing things around the house. The gutters had come loose again, so I climbed the ladder, screwdriver in hand. I tightened each screw until the joint stopped squealing. Then I moved to the garage, popped the hood on my truck, and replaced a worn belt I'd been meaning to get to. The work helped. I've always believed motion keeps a man from rusting, but no amount of tightening bolts could quiet the noise in my head. At dinner, the phone buzzed again. This time a text from an old foreman. He's rearranging shifts. Fired 2 guys for attitude. I read it twice, then deleted it. I didn't want a record of what I already knew. Chase was tearing the place apart piece by piece, convinced he was rebuilding it. The next afternoon, Luis showed up at my door. He looked tired, his uniform smudged with graphite. "You got a minute?" he asked. We sat out back with a couple of beers, the late sun bleeding through the trees. "He's making enemies fast," Luis said. "Cut overtime, canceled maintenance rounds, told the welders they're replaceable. Nobody likes him." I listened, quiet, letting him talk. He was trying to get a reaction, maybe even expecting me to celebrate a little. But I didn't. My anger wasn't the kind that needed an audience. It was cold, methodical, the kind that sharpened itself while pretending to rest. When Luis left, I stayed on the porch until the light died. Then I went inside, poured myself another cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and pulled a thick binder from the top of the closet shelf. My name was written on the cover in fading marker. Steel River Systems personal copy. I hadn't opened it in years, not since we'd gone digital, but the schematics were still clean. Pages lined with notes in my handwriting, pressure tolerances, emergency overrides, shortcuts the computers never learned, every circuit diagram, every service route, every system interlock. I ran my fingers along the pages, remembering where each section lived in the real plant. The sound of each relay kicking in, the rhythm of the conveyors. When everything ran right, that place wasn't a factory to me. It was a living organism I'd kept alive longer than most marriages last. Some men build houses, some build companies. I built something made of heat and motion, and it had my pulse. I closed the binder, set it on the table, and stared at the cover until the coffee went cold. Chase probably thought he was in control now, surrounded by monitors and fancy software, convinced the plant would obey a keyboard. He didn't understand. The plant didn't run on computers. It ran on muscle memory mine. The news came through Luis on a rainy Tuesday morning. "Conveyor 3's down," he said over the phone. "Whole line's dead." Chase has been pacing the floor like a cat in a cage. I could almost see it. Him in that pressed shirt. Sleeves rolled up for the cameras, pretending to know which switch did what. Steel River's production line had never gone down in 35 years. Not once, until now. Luis said they'd been down for 2 shifts already. The company was hemorrhaging money by the hour. Trucks backed up at the loading docks, orders piling in unfilled. Chase says it's the crew's fault, he added. Claims they didn't follow his new maintenance schedule. I leaned back in my chair, the phone warm against my ear. He'll blame everyone but himself, I said. He always did. Corporate would be breathing down his neck by now. They never cared about process, only numbers. And numbers didn't lie. 2 missed shifts would cost them 6 figures at least. That night I drove into town for groceries. I passed the plant on the highway and saw the floodlights blazing through the drizzle, white against the night sky. The air was heavy with ozone, the way it gets after an electrical short. I could tell they'd been running diagnostics non-stop. They'd probably called in an outside consultant by now, someone young, expensive, and useless. Back home, I put the groceries away, then sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about those years of work, every late-night repair, every patch job I'd done on that conveyor. It was an old system, tough but temperamental. I'd warned management for years that it needed full replacement. They'd told me to extend its life. So I had, through patience, instinct, and about 500 hours of overtime. 2 days later, Luis showed up again. He looked worn out, eyes red-rimmed from double shifts. They brought in a crew from Cleveland, he said. Still can't find the fault. Chase overrode the shutdown protocols to speed up diagnostics. Fried 2 control relays instead. I poured him a cup of coffee and waited. He's been rewriting your safety logs, Luis said quietly. Deleted your last inspection notes from the system. I thought you should know. That made me pause. The coolant circuit, my circuit, was tied directly into those logs. If he'd tampered with them, it meant he'd also skipped the inspection due this quarter. The coolant kept the main forge from overheating. 1 bad valve, 1 untested pressure release, and the plant could turn into a firestorm in under 10 minutes. Luis rubbed the back of his neck. He said the system monitors it automatically now. No need for manual checks. I stared into my cup. He doesn't know what he's gambling with. After Luis left, I went into the garage. My old workbench was still cluttered with tools, spare parts, an old torque wrench, a cracked gauge from the plant I'd kept as a souvenir. The air smelled like oil and rain. I stood there for a while, listening to the creak of the rafters, thinking about the line between justice and revenge. Then, I picked up the phone and called the State Safety Board. I didn't give my name, just told them they might want to inspect Steel River's main coolant system before someone got hurt. The woman on the other end thanked me, voice calm and professional, but I could hear her typing fast. When I hung up, I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel guilty either. Just balanced, like a machine, humming at the right frequency. I wiped my hands on a rag and opened the garage door. The storm had passed, leaving everything slick and shining under the streetlights. As I stood there, the sound of rain dripping from the gutters pulled me back to another time, my first week on the job, 22 years old, green as spring grass. Old Foreman Dixon had pulled me aside after I'd rushed a weld and nearly warped a pipe. "Steel doesn't forgive mistakes, kid," he'd said, tapping the metal with his knuckle. "Neither does pride." Back then I thought he was talking about workmanship. Took me years to learn he meant people. The ones who think they're smarter than the process always learn the hard way. I shut off the lights in the garage and went back inside. My coffee was still warm. I took a sip and smiled faintly. I didn't lift a finger. I just stopped protecting them from themselves. It started with the sirens. Not police or fire, those came later, but the internal ones, the kind wired into the plant's nervous system. When Steel River's alarms went off, you could hear them clear across town. I was in my garage, oiling a socket wrench, when the sound carried through the open window. At first I thought I imagined it. some ghost memory of 35 years on the floor. But then came the low wail of real sirens, city ones, and I knew something had gone wrong. Luis called 10 minutes later, voice shaking. "Earl, it happened." The coolant system blew a relief valve. Pressure spiked past limit. Chase tried to override the shutdown. I set the wrench down carefully. Override? He bypassed the safeties. Said the system was overreacting. Tried to keep the forge running to meet production targets. Damn near cooked the entire line. We're lucky nobody was standing close. I stepped outside. In the distance, smoke smudged the horizon, faint but rising. The kind of smoke you don't mistake for anything else. By that evening, the story was everywhere. Local news vans parked outside the gates, reporters shouting questions at guards. Industrial malfunction, they called it at first. Contained incident, no fatalities. But the headlines shifted fast. Once the details leaked, management error causes Steel River shutdown. Corporate sent a crisis team from Chicago. Suits, with tablets, and strained smiles. OSHA inspectors arrived next. Then lawyers with clipboards and calm voices that only made things worse. The plant had been shut down indefinitely. My phone didn't stop buzzing for 2 days. Former crew members called, wanting to vent, or to warn me that investigators might reach out. The union rep left 3 voicemails asking for a statement. Even a young reporter from the Akron Daily Post showed up at my door, hair wind-blown, recorder in hand. "Mr. Simmons, is it true you designed the safety systems Mr. Graves overrode?" I looked at her for a long second. She couldn't have been more than 25. I thought about the noise, the heat, the smell of burning metal still probably clinging to that plant. Then I said, "The plant used to run like clockwork." That's all I gave her. She printed it the next day, word for word. By the end of the week, the board suspended Linda Graves. Pending investigation, they said, but everyone knew what it meant. Her name had become a liability. She'd gambled the company's future on her son, and now both of them were radioactive. Chase hadn't been seen publicly since the accident. Some said he was holed up in his condo. Others claimed corporate security escorted him out of town. I didn't care which was true. The investigators wanted technical data. Pressure logs, maintenance records, inspection histories. All the things I'd kept immaculate for decades, and all the things Chase had erased. Without those files, the story wrote itself. Negligence, ego, ignoring procedure. A perfect storm. And he'd stood in the middle of it thinking he was bulletproof. Luis stopped by on Friday. He looked older than I remembered, shoulders slumped like a man carrying bad weather. "They're asking questions about the old systems," he said, "about who built what, who signed which logs. You might get a call." "I'm not hard to find," I said. He hesitated. "They'll pin it all on him, you know." I met his eyes. Good. He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I'd said. When he left, I stayed at the window, watching the dusk settle over the neighborhood. My reflection stared back, same hands, same lines, same man they'd called outdated. On the TV inside, the news played footage of the plant gates chained shut, workers milling around in reflective vests. The anchor spoke about systemic failures and possible criminal negligence. They didn't understand that nothing about it was systemic. It was personal. Pride, greed, arrogance, all rolled into one bad decision. I poured myself a drink, sat down at the kitchen table, and listened to the hum of the fridge fill the silence. For years I'd kept that plant alive by instinct, fixing problems before anyone knew they existed. It wasn't heroism, it was responsibility. When I left, I took that instinct with me. And without it, the place was just steel and chaos, waiting to collide. Outside, thunder rolled low across the horizon. The smell of rain drifted in through the cracked window, sharp and clean. Somewhere out there, Chase was learning that steel doesn't bend for pride. It breaks. I took another sip, feeling the burn slide down my throat. The truth was about to hit them harder than any hammer in that factory. 3 weeks after the accident, the investigation report dropped like a hammer. The numbers were impossible to ignore. $4.8 million in losses, 8 regulatory violations, and 2 counts of falsified documentation, every single one signed by Chase Graves. They printed the report in black binders with gold lettering, as if dressing it up could make it less damning. It didn't. The board met behind closed doors for 3 hours that morning. By lunchtime, the press release hit every major outlet in the state. Steel River Fabrication announces termination of Regional Director Linda Graves and Operations Manager Chase Graves for gross misconduct and managerial incompetence. I read it twice, sipping coffee at my kitchen table, and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not anger, just a kind of stillness. The kind that comes when a long, slow fall finally hits the ground. I folded the paper, set it aside, and went back to tightening a hinge on a cabinet door that had been loose for months. The next day, corporate legal called. A man named Connor Hayes introduced himself. Polite voice, clipped tone. "Mr. Simmons," he said, "we're finalizing the safety audit, and your name's all over the original systems documentation. We'd like you to consult on our review, just to ensure accuracy." I almost laughed. Months ago, I was too old for the job. Now, I was the only one they could trust to explain what had gone wrong. "Send me the details," I told him. When I arrived at the plant, the air smelled different, cleaner, but hollow. The machinery was silent, the floor empty, except for a few inspectors and clipboard men in suits. The same guards who'd barely looked at me before nodded as I signed in. Inside, the walls still hummed faintly with the memory of work. Every beam and bolt felt familiar, like an old friend that had survived a bad storm. The first face I saw was Luis. He stood near the maintenance bay, hands in his pockets, eyes tired but proud. "Didn't think I'd see you back here, Earl," he said. "Didn't think they'd ask," I answered. He gave a small grin. "Guess they finally figured out who kept this place running." I walked the floor slowly, my boots echoing in the empty space. The conveyor that failed was still half dismantled, its steel plates stacked neatly against the wall. Scorch marks streaked the floor where the coolant valve had blown. I crouched down and touched the surface. Smooth, cold. It wasn't the metal's fault. It was never the metal's fault. In the control room, the investigators waited. They had charts and graphs and too many acronyms, but what they really wanted was someone who understood the heartbeat of the system. I explained how the safeties were layered, how Chase had bypassed them to force continuous output. They listened carefully, pens moving fast, heads nodding. I spoke plainly, the way I always had. No jargon, no emotion, just truth. After 2 hours, Hayes closed his notebook and leaned back. "Mr. Simmons, the redundancies you built prevented a full explosion. Without them, we'd be talking fatalities." I met his eyes. That's why they were there. He nodded slowly. "You saved lives by building it right in the first place." I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say. I just signed the last page of the report, initials neat and steady, and handed the pen back. Walking out of that room felt like the end of something bigger than a career. Someone had tried to cover the burn marks on the walls, but they still showed through faint scars that wouldn't quite disappear. Outside, I stood in the lot for a moment, watching the sky. It was the same dull gray it had always been, the color of cold steel, honest and unbreakable. The wind carried the faint rattle of loose metal sheets from the far side of the yard, the sound of something trying to hold on. I thought about Chase, how he must have believed he could outsmart the machines, outsmart the men who built them. I thought about Linda, sitting somewhere in a quiet office, realizing the company she'd gambled on her son for was done with her. There was no satisfaction in it. Not really. Just gravity. Every action meets its weight in time. I started the truck and looked one last time at the building. For decades, that place had been my world, my burden, and my proof. They could replace names on the doors, repaint the walls, hire new blood, but they couldn't erase what had been built by hand, what had been earned. They called me outdated, but in the end, I was the last man who still knew how to keep it all standing.